So much. I'd like to invite our panelists. Come on up. So, as our actors are finding places in the audience, I want to invite our panelists to come up and take their place at the stage. And as our panelists are coming up, I just want to plant the first seed of the first question I'm going to ask you as an audience as soon as they're done with their brief opening remarks. So here's the question. We'd love for you to think about it. We'll come right back to you as soon as they're done. Now that you've seen these four actors going for broke with minimal rehearsal, leaving their vocal cords on the table, projectile crying into the audience, trying to bring this ancient Greek play to life 2,500 years later. And you know the play was written and performed in Athens at a moment of great democratic reform, and it sort of celebrates the first legal proceedings around murder in the Western world, or interrogates it, depending on your interpretation. In spite of the distance of culture and time, in spite of the 2,500 years since this play was written, the question I'd love for you to think about is simply this: what did you recognize in the story, in the performance, that spoke to you as true to your own experiences? What resonated with you? What transcended and spoke to you across time? We'll return to that question in a few seconds. Before we do, we turn things over to our panel. What I forgot to mention is whoever is making the best eye contact gets to go first. So you've volunteered yourself. No one else looked up. So I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves and launch directly into your comments. Go right ahead, sir.
So my name's Daniel Arshak. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I have been for 35 years. I practice here in New York, around the country, and internationally. My career started as a public defender. I started the Bronx Defenders in the Bronx, and they do public defense work. I'm back into private practice now, and have had the opportunity to think a lot about what it means to do what I do. I do what I do because it's the right thing to do, not because the Constitution says someone's entitled to something, but because it's the right thing to do. I sometimes teach and I speak to law students about why I do what I do, and I look at them and I'll say to you, I do it because what would Jesus do? Who would he stand by? Would he stand by and prosecute a person, or would he stand by someone charged with a crime and be their voice? And so that's what I do. I'm their voice. And so I was moved, of course, by Apollo, who was his client's voice, and he stood by him regardless of what he did. And that's the driving force for defense attorneys in this country and around the world, that we stand by people regardless of what they do. So what did he do? He killed his mother, and was there a reason for it? Turns out there was a reason for it. He heard a voice that told him that he should kill his mother. And this is a defense that defense attorneys use because it's the truth, and it accurately describes what a person charged with an offense has done. So what I'd invite you to do as you think about this play is what experiences have we in this country had when facts are obviously aligned against us, but the jury goes in a direction different than we think they should have? When have they done that? In fact, we call it, we have a name for it in the law. It's called jury nullification. And that happens when the jurors look at the facts and say, you know what, not on my watch. We're not convicting somebody of draft resisting. We're not convicting somebody of murdering a black man during slavery or today. We have the right as jurors to nullify. And so it raises the question, and I'm about out of my time, but I want to underscore that it raises the question of what's the purpose of this exercise, of this trial exercise? Is it about justice? No, I don't think it's about justice. I think it's about punishment. And when the Furies stand up here and cry for justice, they're not really crying for justice. They're crying for revenge. And sometimes we get revenge, and sometimes we don't, but rarely do we get something called justice in a court of law.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Sir, Napoleon.
Hello. So my name is Napoleon Felipe. I am a Bronx free verse poet. I've been with free verse for about 6 years, working with them in the South Bronx. My first start there was going through probation myself. I'm being on probation. Since then, I've worked with many people in their communities. Had the pleasure of being here with you guys and sharing with you guys here in this evening. These are one of the very many things that I get to do as a poet, and to speak with the community about what we do. One thing about poetry that I've done with free verse is realizing for myself is using it as sort of like a reflective mirror, so to speak, to kind of understand where I'm going in life and what I do and the choices that I make, and engaging in people and realizing that I don't live life for myself, but I live for people and helping them find their way through and their change and the things that they need. I guess what best spoke to me about this play was two characters, which was Apollo and Athena. The Furies was an interesting aspect as well. I felt like they reflected a lot of society's desire for, and I say this loosely, for bloodshed almost in a sense. It's like we want to see the drama. We want to see people go down, even if there's something going on, even if the case doesn't seem to stack against them, we want to see that happen. Well, we want to see them hang, so to speak. But as for Apollo and Athena, dealing with the criminal justice system, I've always wanted to see, my day in court, so to speak. Like I wanted to see, when do I get to win? Why is it that I feel like the system is insurmountable? It becomes a daunting prospect when I'm looking at those people with their paperwork and they look really sharp and kind of like intimidating, and they're basically looking at me, and I'm just sitting there and I'm like, my day is done. When do I get my day? When is Apollo going to be at my side? When is Athena going to speak for me and actually help the public see that I was a good person, or so to speak, or not only for myself but for people who've been in that situation, And that's my 2 pieces on it.
Thank you so much, Napoleon.
Hello, I'm Michelle Fields. I'm a supervising attorney with the Legal Aid Society, the Community Justice Unit. Public defender, Gideon soldier, social engineer. I think my destiny was defined as a public defender at the age of 12. I'm here because I represent the people that I see every day that look like me, that come from the community where I was raised. I can identify with the Furies because the Furies represent the Black and Latinos in this state whose voices are not being heard. The statement by Athena when she said, "What man would respect justice if he doesn't fear the law?" I pose that to you because the issue here would then become whose life is more valuable. In a court of justice, everyone's life is valuable. And when Athena says, "Let your Black anger abate," that's telling us not to protest. That's telling us not to rise up and resist. That's telling us not to protest when there's ICE raids every day in the 5 boroughs in court. That's telling us that Black lives and Latino lives are not valuable when there's no justice. Her anger, that rage, is what I see every day. That anger and rage is what I see of Black and Latino mothers. That anger or rage are the mothers and the parents of the Parkland shooting. So when we start to think about how we dissect this play and put it before us in the present, it's representative of what we are seeing today, and all of us can relate to it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Kwesi.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kwesi Dash. I am an attorney with Legal Aid. I've been public defender, criminal defense attorney for the last 10 years. I'm now a community justice attorney working in the same unit with Michelle. I've worked on Rikers Island for a number of years in my career, and also as a trial attorney in the Manhattan Criminal and Supreme Court. And this may be a little offbeat and inappropriate to say, last night I was binge watching and catching up on Homeland, so this is like surreal.
That was a great spit. That was great.
This was a great performance, by the way, and I found for me that this was about the values with which people identify. And what I automatically wrote down, and I'm just going to read some things that I wrote, is that truth is never an absolute. It can be objective, meaning that more than one person can agree that something is true. For example, pizza tastes good, right? A number of people might agree to that, but does that mean that it's true? Truth, however, is often subjective and depends on one's experiences and perspectives and biases. And so what really spoke to me about tonight's performance was the values with which people identify. You listen to Apollo's presentation and what Athena said about why she eventually decided to cast her vote to acquit Orestes. It seems to me that it has a lot to do with the values that they hold or held dear. And if one examines a little deeper, it begs the question of where those values come from, right? What are their backgrounds? What are their experiences? What are their perspectives as a result of their backgrounds and experiences? And as a defense lawyer who's done trials, as a few of us have, that's what you are up against. I'm a public defender as well. I'm an impoverished community, which I still live in. I got into the work that I do because of my experiences growing up in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, being arrested, being locked up as a teenager, and eventually having the good fortune to overcome that and, go through school and become a lawyer. And one of the things that, as public defenders in particular, we're up against is perspectives. The perspectives of the lawmakers, the perspectives of the police, the perspectives of the jurors that make the decisions that have an ultimate impact on the lives of our clients. And the interesting thing about my experience, which I think aligns with what was presented in this play, is that those perspectives dictate the outcome of a trial, right? And interestingly, in my own experience, the people that are the decision makers have perspectives that don't align or experiences that don't align with the people that I represent. So quite often, the results are not in their favor. So.
Thank you so much. I'd love to thank these four panelists with a big round of applause. It's no small thing to be the first people to speak, to take the risk to speak in front of an audience like this after a performance like this. I just want to thank you for your candor, for your courage, for getting us started. And by the way, I mentioned to you before, I'm going to turn my back to you, but not out of disrespect. And like the voice of Apollo or Athena, you can come back into the conversation whenever you feel so moved. You've got live mics, and I hope you will. But now I want to turn out to the audience. And with the time that we have together, get what we can out of the themes we were going to address. And I see a hand. Is that a hand already? To my first question of what resonated with you?
What resonated with me is it's over 3,000 years, and we're still looking for revenge, not justice. Okay, in this, and the accusatory instrument or the prosecutor, they always get to go first and have the last word in America. But she was crying for revenge, not justice. It almost correlates with the Herman Bell. The guy just did 40 years. Was that justice for the crime? And now they're giving him a hard time about getting out. He followed everything for 40 years. The guy gave 40 years of his life. Yeah, what he did was wrong. But they're not crying for justice, they're crying for revenge. And that's where, in this country, it's all about revenge, not justice.
So much for being first. I really appreciate it. Really powerful. You know, this. I was thinking as you were speaking that we've taken this court system and over several thousand years we've internalized the revenge part into our incarceration system, into our penal system, and so that even if the courts work, even if there were justice in the courts, we're still getting our revenge. And I was listening to you thinking about, boy, that's because at the time there wasn't mass incarceration in ancient Greece, obviously. So was that a hand right there making my job?
Okay, thank you. It wasn't, but I'll take it. That's all right. It's all right. I'm an attorney, but I'm not a criminal law attorney, and my own experience, thank God, with the criminal justice system has been as a juror in Miami in a criminal case. What struck me about the presentation, about the play, is that the deciding vote in the acquittal was based not on the review of the facts of the killing and the circumstances of the killing, but on a bias toward affinity with a personal experience, namely that Athena came from the hip of a man, and so a man was responsible. What also for the birth, and was therefore given more deference. What also struck me was how easily the Furies and their passion and their concern for what they thought was justice was mollified by bribe.
Yes.
Which I suppose is not too far from what really goes on in America, but I don't know.
Yeah, so you raised a lot of really powerful things. I mean, I don't want to neglect any side of the audience. I'll come over here, but so here's supposed to be a play as we learn it in school, if those of us who touch it, celebrating the legal system in the West, but already you pointed out several things that aren't really things that should be celebrated necessarily. A certain fallibility based on almost a kind of misogyny that's built into the system that's right front and center. We've had a lot of people at other performances so far bring the Me Too movement right into the discussion, and we should talk about misogyny as it plays out in this play. We shouldn't leave that alone. And then that there's a bribe that's being exchanged at the end. And so the fallibility of the system as it's first created and in its foundations is on display alongside its so-called glory, which complicates things. I see your hand, sir, but I'm going to come over to this side of the audience where there's a hand back here. Someone has a mic. Yeah, back there. Yeah, sure.
Oh, hi. As far as what stood out to me was that this play explained why the revolution will never happen. And by the revolution, I mean the second wave civil rights movement that is meant to stand on the shoulders of the previous one and push us forward into a new era of social justice. Athena, as long as his name was Orestes,
Yes.
who for me is the police officer that always gets away with shooting an unarmed, disenfranchised individual, as long as he's protected by Apollo, who represents the system that is willing to bend to protect those people who have always been in power, and as long as Athena, who stands as the status quo, who will consistently find a way to soothe and to dampen that fury, that anger, and as long as the Furies are always willing to, succumb to a bribe, Athena is that leader within the community, within the Black community, that always stands up and whether it be that mayor or it be just some speaker that everyone knows, that's always going to say, hey guys, don't riot in Boston. Hey guys, don't go to the streets. Go back home, and we'll find a different way. That's what this play was for me.
Mm-hmm.
Why that revolution never happens.
Thank you so much. I mean, I hear you saying something that's I've never thought about either. It's like the systems of oppression that we see in place now playing out aren't simply the product of post-Civil War, unreconstructed America. They are the product of the ancient Greco-Roman system upon which the entire system was built. And I think it's a really powerful thing to bring into the room, and I really appreciate your perspective. Is there anyone over here who wants to take on this first question? Was there something that resonated with you or spoke to you as truthful tonight, in spite of the distance of culture and time, what spoke to you? Sure, yeah, right here.
Well, I'm a criminal trial attorney, and I just want to say with the Furies, on the occasions that I've had a client be convicted, and the jury will render its verdict, and then I think the verdict is wrong. And the verdict is wrong because the police lied and the judge made sure the verdict was guilty. And I wanted to scream, just like how the Furies did. Where is justice? I mean, I want to scream and cry. And instead I crawl back to I stand there and accept the verdict, and then I crawl back to my office, and then I cry. But I really related to that, and I felt like sitting up there with her, screaming just the way that she did.
Thank you so much. I mean, you point out something really important, which is that there is no place for the Furies in our legal system. There is no place for screaming. If you show emotion in a legal proceeding, the judge will bang the gavel and say, order in the court, unless it's a very progressive or open-minded judge who sees, like the Larry Nasir trial recently with regard to sexual assault on so many young women, bringing their voices into the court and allowing that to be heard, not in the spirit of vengeance, but in a kind of an effort toward restorative justice, of having them have a place for that. But there's no place for people to express their anger in our system, so where does it happen? And what is the court for? Because in the ancient world, it seems like Aeschylus was saying the court is a theater. It is a place where this can happen. So what happens when defense attorneys, prosecuting attorneys, families who've seen the verdicts come down that are clearly unjust, have no place for those emotions and for expressing them? And where do those emotions go? I know you've had your hand up. Yeah, go right ahead. Yes.
So I hear people railing about, and I hear this all the time, and I'm hearing it here as well, railing about the lack of justice coming out of our courts. And I just want to suggest to you that we're looking at the wrong place to find justice in our courts. It's not what courts are for. Courts aren't designed to render justice. Courts are designed either to render punishment or not punishment. That's it. That's just it. And if what you want is justice, then you talk to your community, and you talk to your neighbors, and you talk to your politicians, and you talk to the places where you live, and you have alternatives to bringing someone to court and deciding if you're going to be punishing them or not. I think it's and I will admit that when I went into this work, I thought that I would be engaged in a search for justice. But it didn't take long to realize that that's just not what it's about. And we waste an enormous amount of time and energy and community organizing by organizing around a search for something that doesn't exist in the courts.
Right.
As if you get your day in court, which 96% of people don't.
Right.
So go ahead, please.
I totally agree with my colleague. I think it starts with, one, being a part of the process, sitting at the table and being the voices that make the laws, because laws are made by men, but the laws need to reflect the people, and that's all of us in here. And if you want to make a difference, you start with the school to prison pipeline. You start with, a better education system. You start with paying our teachers more. You start by providing resources to those families that have children that need more resources with IEPs. You start by bringing more, services in impacted communities. You start by not only being a part of the process, but sitting on a jury. Becoming a community advocate, self-advocating for your community, demanding that you have more services. Being on a PTA board is a way to begin, because the prison to school pipeline is real. And this system is punitive. It's not restorative, but it could be. Norway has shown us that it could be restorative. The Nordic countries, the blueprint is already there. But as long as we have private prisons, as long as you continue to have the 13th Amendment, which allows slavery within the prison system will never change. But we, all of us here, could make a difference just by being a part of the change.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to come over here to my friend who I met the other night.
Hi. Gosh, there's something that you just said that it's hard for me to deal with. When you say that it starts in the community, I have to ask. If a man gets convicted of a crime that he didn't commit and goes to jail for 40 years, I don't think it has to start in the community. It's already in the community that we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't have to riot. By the time it gets to the court,
It's too late.
it's
too late.
But it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. Because here's the deal. You also mentioned something about truth. If I walk into a bank and say, I feel like I have $1 million, please give it to me. That's my perspective. It's either I have $1 million or I don't. The problem is if we look at a tape of somebody being killed, we're constantly being asked to not believe your eyes. So that's why when this gentleman talked about revolution, I was like, no, revolution's gonna start because people are gonna get tired of lying to themselves. No, he's not really being killed. Revolution will happen anyway, because if I decide to hurt my neighbor, do you understand what I'm saying? If I decide to hurt my neighbor, that's something that the courts have to decide, because I can decide.
I have to say I completely disagree with you. Respectfully, and here's
If
why.
I decide to hurt him.
I'll tell you why. It's not for the courts to decide. If you injure your neighbor, it's for your neighbors to decide. That's the point when a community comes together and says, we're not going to permit injury by neighbors against neighbors. And we're going to do a restorative justice to something to bring you back as a member of our community. But you're right when you say it's too late once it gets to court, because then it's just about punishment.
Okay, this is where I have to say it's perspective, because the problem is we already don't believe that people should go to jail for crimes they didn't commit. We already don't believe. There's nobody, I don't know if there's anybody in here who believes that you should just kill someone for nothing. It's already in the community. So by the time it gets legal, by the time it goes to the courts, that's to execute yes, it is about justice, it is about order. So we are not running amok, killing each other based on what we think or our own perspective.
Could I suggest a slightly different example? So, going out and killing somebody, that's one thing. It's sort of at the far end of but the far more common situation is domestic violence. Domestic violence happens incredibly commonly, and the knee-jerk response, as you know, working in the Legal Aid Society, the knee-jerk response is you arrest the person who's alleged to have committed the violence, and they go to court. There are other ways of dealing, and what happens then? That person leaves the home sometimes loses the income from that person, children lose a parent. It's this cascading series of events that happens thousands and not, homicides are fairly rare, thank goodness, but domestic violence thousands and thousands and thousands of times a year in this city, and we deal with it in this knee-jerk way by thinking wrongly that we're going to have a solution to this in court, when it's the community that needs to say, we're not going to permit domestic violence in our community. We're going to sit with you and we're going to talk with husbands and wives and children about what it is that compels violence in a family relationship.
So I'm going to split the difference here for a second and just say, because I think these are really great points. I hear on one hand, and I've heard this in other performances, in other communities, in other discussions, to sit back while a body that Athena calls, or Apollo calls, an august body that is dressed in the entrapments and the language of justice, parades, the Supreme Court parades the pageantry, all the things she describes in her big monologue about how the court should assert its power is through the rhetoric of justice. To be a disenfranchised member of a disenfranchised community, watching that pageantry, and then to accept that the court isn't the place where justice will be found is a really hard pill to swallow, I think. On the flip side, I hear from your hard-won many years as a public defender a real desire to take these conflicts out of this system and back into the community. I think it's a really powerful sentiment as well. Yeah.
Can I but I think though that the question then becomes what the definition of justice is, right? And you talk about perspective. Now, if you're speaking about murder, I mean, that sort of evokes a lot of emotion. You think about yourself in that position and what you would want the outcome to be. And justice for you might look like punishment. But to reiterate the point of what is far more prevalent and more diabolical and destructive to communities, murders are not that prevalent in sort of the grand scheme of punishment and imprisonment. Particularly for those of us that do public defense work. We represent a lot of mentally ill people, all poor people, homeless people, people with drug addiction issues, right? And that's what you see time and again. And they're punished for being poor, right? So when you think about the statement of courts not being a place where justice is served, you have to consider things outside of the scope of violent crimes, right? And I think that will sort of broaden your perspective about the statement, because all of the people that we've represented over the years, the great majority of them, most of them are not people that have been accused of murder, right? And most of them are people that are poor and that are just a part of a system that's designed to punish them.
Thank you so much. We're going to come over here. And Napoleon, we'll come back to you in just a sec, but he's been waiting for a long time. After him, I'm going to ask a second question, and we might even get to a third before the cookies, but just hold tight, because we are moving towards something. I like to give people at least the illusion that we're moving towards something. Thank you so much for waiting. Yeah.
Now, just to piggyback off what you said, I agree with you 110%. So when I think about the criminal justice system, the criminal justice system is not about whether you're right or wrong. It's all about what you can prove and what you can't prove. So I believe that, minorities, African Americans and Hispanics, we were robbed of a third knowledge of self. And our problem is we're dependent on the same systems that were built against us to help us. So it does start within the community. We have personal issues and we go to court, and then the court does nothing but divide families and incarcerate, black men and women. So, we got to get it together.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So
Yeah,
then
please, go ahead.
I asked, how do you mobilize a marginalized community? How do you mobilize a community that's over police, and there's a lot of hyper policing? How do you mobilize a community that is, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder because of all the violence? How do you mobilize a community that you say there's no stop and frisk, but every day there's stop and frisk? Every day, people are being displaced from NYCHA housing. There's exclusions, and there are gang raids on a monthly basis where young Black and Latino men, starting from the age of 12 all the way up to 56, are being charged with federal crimes. How do you mobilize community that is being gentrified and people are being displaced? So it does start in a community, but you have to create policies for a better community, for a better living for all people, and it's about equality. And most people are asking for parity. Most people want that same justice and that same consideration that Meek Mills was given, because most of my clients don't get an opportunity to now appeal their probationary sentence.
That's right.
Most of my clients don't have a New York Knicks owner coming to their defense. So it's a lot of things we can address here, but it's not the time. But the most important thing is that we have the privilege, and we need to use our privilege to make a difference.
Thank you so much. Napoleon, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yeah,
so.
I just wanted to chime in on a lot of places that people had touched base on, and my panelist here, she touched on something of a word that I've been trying to use. Like I wanted to say culture, but when she said policy, I think that was best said. But I still want to ring on that word culture as far as and excuse me if I'm out of base with that, but I feel like what we all want the same thing. Even in this room, we're here for a reason. We're not just here to see a couple of people just speak on a panelist. We're not here to see, not only just a couple of people, but significant people, and we're here for change. That's just, I would like to use that word, for change. We're here to make a difference. We're here to, enlighten ourselves, to see what can we do as a people to better our society, to make sure that people get fair justice in the courtroom, that they get fair justice outside on the streets. Being a man who is, a man of color, myself, being afraid that I have to go out in the street if a cop looks at me, he's not profiling me, he's not looking at me, looking to put me to the side and say, hey, where you've been, what time, all that stuff, and seize my pockets and stuff like that. But I want to live in a society where people are making a decision where they're saying, or they're not only looking to fill their pockets and getting a mark on their shoulder or a pat on the back saying, hey, good job, taking that piece of SHIT out of here and making sure he goes to prison, stuff like that. As I grew up, I always grew up with this idea with this mythological idea that the prisons were not in power for me. They were not in favor of me. They were in favor of a small group of individuals who want society controlled. And I know that sounds like really out there, but that's how I've always grew up seeing our society. And I would like to live in a society that doesn't feel like that, but that my neighbor looks at me and says nothing but, I love you, brother. That's a little out there, maybe that's a little fantasy, but for me, I would love that, to have someone to tell me that that their best interest is my best interest. You understand what I mean? Like,
I'm going to shift. Thank you so much for everything everyone said. I'm going to shift gears to a second of 3 questions. And here's the question. Why are the Furies so angry? And who are the Furies today? Now, we've had a couple of interpreters. You've been waiting for so long, sir. I see you're about to become a Fury if I don't come over to you with the microphone.
Actually, I was going to address that question. You asked before about things we responded to, reacted to. One of which was said one of which you said about there are no Furies, so there's no. I think there are. I think the population and the media are the Furies today. I think almost everybody, and of course there are exceptions, but I mean almost everybody, when we see in the TV news or read the paper that so-and-so was indicted, we assume that person is guilty. So I think, the anger starts there on the indictment. But you're right, by the time we get to court, I think it's too late. I think upon indictment, we just assume a person is guilty. The other thing I responded to in the play, if I could say before, about the jury being tied and the judge. So now I'm not a lawyer, but I've known a lot of criminal defense lawyers. I've worked for freeing innocent people off of death row and things like that. I've heard from many, almost every criminal defense lawyer I've ever spoken to, that most judges, not all, most judges see themselves as part of the prosecution. I think it would be very rare for a tie for the judge to vote for acquittal. That's just based on what I've heard.
Thank you so much. Do you want to jump in? Yeah, please.
I also wanted to say that the Furies could also represent the women, Black, white, Latino women in the court system every day, where we have to face misogynistic judges, clients, and for me, is you have to deal with 3 different fronts. You're black, you're a woman. And that's for all the women. And we have judges that scream at us, that will give a male, an adjournment before they would give us an adjournment. We have clients asking, I rather have a male than a female. And I definitely rather have a male because you're black and you're a woman. And I think all the women here, be it a lawyer or any other profession, we have to, as the Furies, we have to deal with this on a day-to-day basis.
I appreciate that, making it that general, because the way it was presented tonight, and David we talked about it off stage, the Apollo is kind of like an old boys club.
Yes.
It's like, even though Athena's a woman or she's a female goddess, so to speak, even though she's born from Zeus's head, and that there's, and she celebrates all things male, as she says in the text, there's this unspoken code that's being expressed between Apollo, this older, austere man who's venerating her, and it must set up a really powerful dynamic in the courts.
Yes. Hi. I'm so excited that you said that, because I'm sitting here going, wanting to say, I thought it was very interesting that the mother killed the father, and then the son killed the mother, and everybody's saying, but she killed the father. That's why I killed her. So, for me, I'm a special education teacher. I believe that, we're all important, everyone, black, white, female, male, So to say two wrongs make a right, not really, Women are just as important as men. Blacks are just as important as whites. And I think that goes back to society and how we view things, and what you brought up just now, and it's important to look at.
Right.
Thank you so much. I appreciate having a special education perspective. That's really terrific. We haven't had that before, but there's some hands back here. I know there's a hand over there as well, so right there is fine, yeah. And sir, I'll come back to you in a second. People are fighting over the mic.
Oh, great. I wanted to say thank you for that as well, and those comments. The thing that really struck me about the play is that we have two crimes. We have the crime against Agamemnon and the crime against Clytemnestra. And the Furies are arguing without the benefit of the great law of Apollo and Zeus. The only thing they have to argue that it's wrong to kill a woman is basically tradition and blood loyalty. And they're in the position of saying, this has to be considered wrong by the ancient rules that say it's your own mother, because they have no other law. The courts do not sustain them. The law of Apollo does not consider what was done to Clytemnestra a crime. This is like the domestic violence story, where the worth of the life of the woman has no value in the official law of the courts, and therefore it's the Furies crying out that there has to be more than that. And this whole idea that we have courts and the idea of justice, because without it, people fall back onto vengeance. People take matters into their own hands. And that one of the things courts do for societies is stop these cycles of violence. And theoretically, we're supposed to believe, or the story here is that Athena makes it all okay. She convinces the Furies that they don't have to take matters in their own hands. But before I came here, I was reading up on the play and learned that Athenian democracy arranged on this court system failed after about 50 years. And it's very striking to me how it seems such weak sauce, the way the Furies are handled. They are so easily bribed, and their concern for the life of a murdered woman is put so easily aside. And it feels to me like these are the roots of undoing of that society, and maybe our own, where there are lives that are not considered valuable except to people screaming in the streets. And there's this sense that we can't get justice out of our laws.
Right.
And then it falls apart.
Right.
It's going to take us, a few more years, but we might be on that path. I appreciate all of your perspectives. Someone over here, you have a mic already. That's terrific. Thank you. It's on.
Okay, my name is Christina Ramirez. I'm actually a public defender at the Legal Aid Society. These are some of my colleagues up here. But it's interesting because, not to get too deep into your actual play, but just the behavior and the very beginning from the actress that was sitting here at the end, that behavior, I don't know how many of y'all have actually sat in a courtroom for a trial recently, but at least in Queens, that's the behavior of a prosecutor in Queens. And that doesn't matter if, we were over here, this audience over here was laughing at the behavior up there because it almost seemed, it was ridiculous. But you can go watch a trial that's a bench trial, or which means just the judge, or a trial that's for some low-level misdemeanor for one of our clients who has stolen food because it's a homeless person. Or you can go watch a trial where somebody is being accused of robbery or burglary or some kind of felony assault for making somebody a vegetable, and that is their behavior. It doesn't matter how great or small it is. That is the prosecutor's behavior in many of these cases, where everything is an outrage and everything, even if there's justification, which is kind of alluded to in this thing, even if legally by law that person has committed a crime, but there's a reason behind it, for example, homelessness and needing food, that behavior is like all of the prosecutors.
Self-righteous.
I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think a lot of them, I think it was Kwesi who kind of alluded to it, or there was somebody up here that was talking about a lot of the prosecutors or the people in the system these days, and that can be judges, prosecutors, whoever else, probation officers, many of them don't have experiences of the people that they're monitoring or prosecuting. And so to them, it could be stats. It could be that they just need a W so they can move up and get their bonuses or get to a more senior position in their office. Or it can be that they've just never experienced the fact that sometimes when you're homeless and you don't have money, you have to get food. And for them to steal is just like, how could you do that? Because they've never been in that position to be so hungry that they had to steal.
Right.
Thank you so much. You've been waiting a long time.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. It's Michelle, yes?
Yes.
Your comments about the Furies as representing people crying for justice, which is what the Fury actually said, really struck me. And it made me think that the what some people have called a bribe of the Furies is a little more complicated than that. The Furies, in a sense, are given access to belong in the community by a god. And the need for that overrides the need for revenge, which I think is an access that disenfranchised communities don't have in our society. That the gods in our society don't necessarily have an interest in inviting them in any way, whether through bribes or through, in our society what tends to happen is it feels like crumbs are given to get people to give up their protest and their rage. That's sort of how I saw the Furies. I think that the offer is more their acceptance of the offer is more complicated, and it's not one that is necessarily analogous to any offer that's made to any justifiably angered community that we have today.
Right. Well, the bribes in our community today would be naming the street of Sean Bell in Queens. That's what the mothers are given to quiet them in the settlements. That's what be the bribes in our community.
Right. Which is a radically different proposition than what Athena's putting on the table for the Furies, but I appreciate you sort of following the analogy through. You have a hand here. I'm going to move after you to my final question.
I was really struck by what I thought Apollo and Orestes were such a couple of weasels. With apologies to our furry friends. Because Orestes was like, dude, I'm cursed. And Apollo was like, but Zeus is in charge. And it was so interesting in just the very simple staging here. And then they both left. Orestes left and Apollo left. And who remains but the Furies and Athena, two women who are now trying to work it out somehow. Yeah, I was so struck by the fact that the two men left the stage, they won, the women are left and have to kind of figure it out. Yeah.
Would that it would be left to women in our current situation to figure it out. You had a hand over here. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
You had asked about who are the Furies.
Who are the Furies? Yeah.
my worry, and some of this worry comes from you saying that the community has to decide what to do about the batterers or whomever. My worry is that the Furies are the people who feel like their culture is being taken away from them. Maybe it's because the lynching museum opened this week. I don't know. But my real fear is if you let the community decide what to do about the domestic violence or about the crime that has been committed, you end up with that issue and you end up with the Furies.
Yeah, we're not as a country so far removed from the kind of vengeance that the Furies are advocating for, a kind of Sharia law, a kind of blanket retaliatory violence of the Old West, of the antebellum South, and we're talking about something we're not so distant from. So I hear you saying, were it not for the courts or a legal system that actually works, how quickly would we as a society descend into a place where all the Furies, maybe on the right, I hear you talking about, we've certainly seen them showing up with weapons, but also on the left. I'm not equating the two. How quickly would we dissolve into a kind of retaliatory, vengeful society without those structures? That's why we look to them for this. So I'm going to shift to my final question because we've touched upon it. I promise it's the last question, and right afterwards we're going to continue casually over surveys and cookies, and it will be great. But here it is. I just wanted to go a little bit deeper on what's already been mentioned about that final moment in the scene. So Beth Marvel, who had to go, unfortunately, she really did, she's got a film tomorrow, and I'm not sure what's left of her voice after the performance, but she really laid it out. And in the Aeschylus' text, the Furies repeat the same lines twice. They have these huge speeches. And by the way, there's this apocryphal story from a biographer of Aeschylus. I'm sure it's not true, that when the Furies came out on stage in this original production, it was so fear-invoking for the audience. There was so much awe in the presence of these vengeful spirits that women fainted and even had miscarriages. And that this is not a truthful statement, but it's written by someone probably hundreds of years after the play was performed, extrapolating from the play what history might have been. But what I think it reveals is how the Greeks saw the Furies. The ancient Greeks thought of the Furies, that these are people who actually could make you have a physiological response, these goddesses in your, that this is beyond anything you could ever imagine. So at the end of the play, Beth Marvel, playing the Furies, is screaming at the top of her lungs, and for some of us, it's pushing us past our capacity to want to be in the room. The note I give actors, to those of you who come to our performances regularly, is make them wish they'd never come, and Beth did an excellent job. Each of our plays has a moment, and that was the moment for this play. Some people were laughing, a totally legitimate response. Some people were laughing with recognition, talking about the prosecutorial perspective. The sort of rhetorical perspective of screaming outrage. I saw people wiping away tears by the end of the scene. Some people were lamenting what it meant to them. So here's this scene in which the Furies are repeating themselves over and over again, screaming at the top of their lungs, and Athena stays with them. And then eventually she says, I shall never grow tired of listening to you and talking with you and telling you about the offer that's on the table. And she stays. She doesn't leave. I wanted to leave. She didn't leave. And then something happens. I'm not sure what it is. We were talking about it in rehearsal. I don't know what it is, but something happens, and the Furies move in a new direction. And they accept the offer on the table, which is to become the goddesses of marriage and of childbirth and to take a respected place in the city. And I guess I wanted to ask you, we've talked about it a little bit, but what do you make of that ending? And in terms of what happens to the Furies and that decision that they make at the end, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Some people have already put their opinions forth, but I just want to go a little bit deeper into that moment. And I see your hands over here, and I'll come over here to you, ma'am, just 1 second.
Yeah, hello. I think money makes people move funny. You know? Yeah, you wanted to say something, Dave?
I just followed that up by saying that it strikes me that in that moment, and you guys have touched on it several times about, it seems like it's a fight between two men ultimately, and you're the Greek scholar and can tell us where Oedipus fits into all this, right? But it seems to me that his mother did him a favor. He didn't have to kill his father. She did the work for him. And yet, in the end, you know, she was really his savior. And then he still...
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Both those perspectives. Ma'am, you had...
I was just going to say, when it comes to fury, you think back to the times when we've been so angry, and then somebody comes to us with that offer, and we rebuke it over and over and over and over again. Suddenly, fear starts to creep in. When she tells her that I will, you know, if you choose to leave, I'm not going to stop, but I'm going to be here, continue to offer. We can be so angry, but then at that one moment, fear that what if they do stop offering and I do have to leave? I'm gone and now I have nothing. So let me just take whatever they're gonna give me. We let our fear take over, and instead of continuing the fight, we stop fighting because we're scared we're not gonna have anything in the end.
Right. Thank you so much. Now's the time where I want to acknowledge I have several of my lawyers in the audience. I won't point out who they are, but one of the reasons this project exists is because I've had a couple of legal experiences. I want to say that it's a rite of passage, I think, as a human being to be sued at some point in your life. And the rhetorical strategies of both sides of the legal teams are always those of provoking fear to each other. And so much of our court system is predicated upon things that happen outside of the court system, where people are in rooms together with lawyers making arguments to provoke fear. And I think about what you're saying about that impulse to take, well, I'm just going to, I don't think I can hold on any longer. I'm just going to take this offer, even though I know it's terrible. Yeah.
At the end of the day, isn't it really who's scared her to lose?
Yeah, right. Right. Yes.
At the end of the day,
Who's more frightened?
Who's more frightened? Who's going to frighten
Yeah.
who the most?
Yeah.
So they finally break and
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate it. There's a bit waiting back here. Yes, ma'am. You go ahead.
Well, this play ends and it doesn't really feel like it was a tragedy. It almost seems like things happened the way they were supposed to happen. Things are resolved. But the Furies who weren't represented and had to speak for themselves, they ended up having to take a bribe, and just their voice, which was struggling to be heard, was silenced in the end. And their frustration throughout the play of being able to, without any sort of support or representation, express themselves, and repeating things because they can't really express themselves or defend themselves on their own, and screaming, which is a replacement for words. I just think it's so interesting how that character was funny to the audience, how they were, your question, why were the Furies so angry? Well, my question was, why were they so funny? And why, to the very end, they were funny. To the end, yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll counter one offer for why I think people will laugh. And I want to say real quickly that even though we're here at WNYC, most of our work takes place in housing developments, homeless shelters, community centers, where the normal rules of how we're socialized to consume theater are out the window. And they're the most exciting places to perform, because then people don't laugh when it's appropriate to laugh and cry when it's appropriate to cry, but they have a natural reaction to the performance. We've all been sort of desocialized to actually be real in the theater. So I appreciate that people laugh, and sometimes people laugh at our performances because there's no place in our culture where you can actually hear the extremity of what's being expressed on stage in these plays, where even in the contemporary theater, I challenge you to go to the Public Theater or to Lincoln Center and have someone scream and see someone screaming the way Beth was tonight. It's inappropriate even in the theater in the Western world, in New York City. We go to the theater to consume it, and so. But I appreciate your question. It's a really good question. I'm gonna let it float. Why are they so angry, and why are they so funny? But maybe someone else wants to take on this final question. Yeah, over here,
Well,
Brian.
I thought it was interesting that my reaction to the Furies and watching them sort of take the offer on the table was this sort of immediate rush to judgment and to say, why would they take that? Like, they had a valid point of view. But in the end, I also feel like the more I sat with it, the more I realized they were the voice of the disenfranchised. And the thing that they wanted, it was clear in what they were saying and the offer that they did take, was to be enfranchised. They wanted a franchise, and Athena was offering them that franchise. And so it's easy to judge them for giving up on the values they were trying to represent, but it's also potentially more challenging to look at it and say, why did they take that? What were they taking? What does it mean to them, right? Like, they had to make a decision for themselves at the end. Is that valid or not?
I think that's a really great perspective and a really great point. We're going to take a couple more. Yeah, you want to jump in?
I just want to say that another perspective on this play is that it was fixed from the beginning. There was never, ever a chance that Orestes was going to get convicted. Let's think about it, right? His lawyer is a god. His lawyer says, I'm responsible because I made him do it. And he sits there and says, yeah, well, he made me do it. The judge is the daughter of Zeus, right? Zeus sent a word to his lawyer to tell him to do it. So if we really think going in that this was a trial, it wasn't. This was a sham trial from the very beginning, and the Furies knew that. They knew it. They live in that world. They knew it going in, and they knew that coming out what the result was going to be and what they could get out of it. And they got exactly what they wanted. Going in, they knew the outcome, and coming out, they got what they expected to going in. But they had to go through the charade. Yeah. Great show, but it was fixed from the beginning.
I was with you for 90% of that, and then it took a total. It took a total turn. But maybe, go ahead. Yes.
The DA in my case 2 years ago, who was the son-in-law of our Supreme Court judge in the same building, and also the husband of a prosecutor in the same building, thought he had a sure win in my trial, and when a 5-count acquittal came back, he had to go to his father-in-law while he was in court and tell him that he lost his trial. And it was the trial that, his father-in-law told him, this is the trial you should have won. So even when it's stacked against us, and we deal with nepotism every day, we deal with the favoritism, but, the fight, the zealousness, and the advocacy, wins every time. The truth wins every time. And we have some amazing defenders. And, unlike the Furies, every day it's a fight for us. And we continue to fight, for justice for our clients.
Thank you. I appreciate you bringing that story of success into the room as well. Because
Right.
we haven't had a lot of those in the stories you shared. Napoleon, did you want to jump in? Yeah.
Yeah, I it was more of a question for me in my mind instead of just input. More like, what do we do now then? Like, what happens next? Like, how do we, just as he mentioned, it was Rick from the start, and I'm sure a lot of people who haven't had the experience of being on the winning side or have ever just had a day in court and they're there and they're waiting for, the judge's verdict or whatever, and then they just get that losing part, and then they feel like, damn, the system won again. When does that change? Like, what do we do to change that?
Well, I think some of the people who are changing it are on the stage with you right now.
Of course.
A month ago, we did a performance of our gun violence project. We had folks from the Cure Violence models throughout the city. That's also supervised by Legal Aid. And this, as those of you, I'm sure who know, that Cure Violence is a model that's actually reducing crimes, especially violent crimes in our city, by treating violence as a public health epidemic and not seeing a difference between the difference between perpetrator and victim, and really going out into the community, as has been suggested, and addressing people where violence occurs. And so that's one end of it, and the other end is getting organized with folks like this. And I also think the stuff that the DOP is doing in neon sites, and the stuff you guys are involved in, is also the front edge of this all, as some of the other organizations who are in the room. We have time for a couple more, so you're going to go, and then there's going to be one more person who's going to have. And you've already gone, but you have the mic, so I can't take it from you. No pressure. You're going to have the last words. Not saying something brilliant, but yeah, go right ahead.
So I was just going to say that the deal at the end kind of reminded me of a plea deal. I had a cousin who is a public defender in New Orleans, and she talked about kind of one of the cases that struck her the most was a 20-year-old guy who stole a woman's purse. He was a black guy who stole a white woman's purse, and it was his third minor offense. So he was facing life in prison if he went to trial. And basically it was them convincing him that since he was a black guy stealing a white woman's purse in New Orleans, if he went to trial, there's probably a 95+% chance that he would be convicted. And if he took their plea deal, he would face 20 years, maybe 25 years in prison. And it kind of felt to me that same thing of the Furies kind of don't get their justice, and it feels like they're getting something, but it's because the threat of banishment forever makes this other thing feel like a good option, where not really any of it is a good option. So that's...
Thank you so much for tying all those threads together. Oh, you got a part 2 right here.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
sorry.
Yeah.
No,
Sure.
I just, back to the Furies again. For me, I agree with whoever it was that said that they're partially the disenfranchised, but I also just felt like, for me, they were being appeased. And they weren't really getting what they wanted. They were just being appeased and kind of, in a sort of a way, put down. And what they said more than once was not only did they want justice, but they wanted respect. And so I was really struck by them never being heard, and the buildup of how you feel when you've never been heard. And there was also a little bit of, ageism in there too, because there was mention of gray hair and this feeling that they've been the wise ones. And now all of a sudden there's this new system and they're not part of it and they're just being dismissed. So the feeling of like lack of respect is so connected to justice, I think for a lot of people.
Thank you so much. That's a grear advertisement for our King Lear project, which will be coming here sometime soon, which will be on dementia, elder care, and ageism. But I appreciate bringing that into the room as well, all the things you said. Sir, you've been waiting a long time. No pressure to sum everything up into a perfect statement.
Yes.
But
I heard someone mention, why we laughed at the play.
Yeah, thank you.
But, sometimes you gotta laugh to keep from crying. So if you've never been in a certain situation, you would never understand. Now, second point.
Thank you.
To piggyback off of what you said, brother, everything does start with us. How we start is, we have to educate our own people, elect our own people, and put our own people in office. So that way we can have certain laws, that protect minorities.
That's right.
Thank you so much for those 2 comments. That's a perfect last word. Thank you so much. We didn't come here to end the conversation. We just came here to start it. And we hope it'll continue over cookies out in the lobby. But before you go, I just want to do one quick thing, which is to acknowledge that in all of your programs, there's a survey, and we really value your feedback. It's not a quid pro quo for a cookie, but if you could do it, we'd really appreciate it. And number 2, this question of where do we go from here, whether this play seems relevant 100, 200, 300 years from now is wholly predicated on what people do when they leave this space. It's through dialogue, through discussion that we're going to get there, and through the great work of some of the organizations and people who are here. Finally, I just want to thank our panelists and our actors with one large, big round of final applause. Thank you so much. Our last performance on this series will be June 13th. We'll be doing our corrections project, Prometheus in Prison. I think tickets are going very fast, but I hope we'll see you here on the 13th. We'll have folks from the Department of Corrections, Department of Probation, formerly incarcerated corrections officers talking about Prometheus Bound. Hope you have a great night, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care. Bye.